Perfect. So thank you all for tuning in today. This is our final webinar series for 2024. We've been doing something new in starting these, and we're really excited to be engaging with you all. My name is Natalie Rea. I'm the UX and Community Engagement Researcher with SESAR, and I'm joined on the call today by Sabyl Cho, who's the Data Curator at SESAR, and we may have additional SESAR team members tuning in today as well. And I will highlight the team in the next slide. Today's webinar is pitched as SESAR for students. I think with the asterisk that we are all students, right? We're all always learning, particularly as it relates to sample management and persistent identifiers for samples and so on. And so we're really glad that you're here today. I will go ahead and advance. Here's the full team. SESAR is headed by Project Director Kirsten Leonard, who is at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, based out of Columbia University. Our product manager is Andrea Thomer, based out of the College of Information Science at University of Arizona. Sabyl Cho, who's with us today, is our data curator. Sean Kao is the systems engineer, myself, and then we're joined as well by a team of technical consultants, an application developer, and our business officer, Sarah Robinson. So this is the full team. SESAR is funded as part of the larger IETA-2 NSF data facility. And so some of us work part-time for other systems that are part of that. And some of us have additional other academic projects outside of SESAR. Today, we're going to talk about what sample metadata is, what persistent identifiers for samples are. We're going to cover what SESAR is and the services that we offer, as well as some tips about how to use persistent identifiers, IGSNs, in publications and data sets. We'll have some time for questions and answers, and then I'm hoping to have some time as well to do live demos, and that seems to be something that's very helpful for people. And so in terms of questions and answers, if you wish, you can put questions in the chat as we go along, and I am monitoring the chat to some extent, so I can try to live answer some of those. Saves is also going to help answer some of them. And then we'll pause before we do any live demos to make sure that we have some further discussion and can get your questions answered. We'll also circulate some information, some links today, and our general email for staying in touch. We'll circulate at the end and throughout the presentation probably. So sample metadata. We all may be coming to this presentation with various awarenesses of what this means. I'm going to just set out some overarching definitions here, and we can have some conversation, and we're going to do a little bit of interactive Zoom chat Q&A too. So metadata is data that defines or describes other data. And so sometimes people will say this is data about data. So sample metadata then is data that describes samples or specimens. This is data about samples or specimens. In the Zoom chat, as you're comfortable, if you could list what kinds of sample metadata you collect about your samples. We're going to see what different users characterize as sample metadata. So go ahead and take a few seconds now to just put some stuff in the chat. Regain my... Okay, good. We have some stuff coming in. Let's see. Geographic location. Yep, GPS coordinates, latitude, longitude. Geographic temporal, so maybe time that the sample was collected or produced. Owners, yeah, so there's descriptive metadata, there's provenance metadata, there might be methodological metadata, descriptions, other things. How about field notes, maybe descriptions of observations related to where that sample was located, or photos. Maybe different classifications, or if you work with soils, maybe you're following a color classification. Yep, instruments. So, and sometimes that might be, related to data that's being produced on the sample, but sometimes it might actually be, if you're working with experimental samples, it might be the type of instrument you use to synthesize the sample. Great. So there's a range, right? And I think some of the ones that come to mind fastest for people sometimes, especially in geosciences, might be geographic location, and that's a really important one. Okay, and we have concepts of bare minimum. I'm looking in the chat. Bare minimum for our staff. Types of sample, location, a collector, a date, an elevation, or depths. Yeah, so why is it important to have this type of metadata? You can put it in the chat, you can unmute and call out. What does this metadata do for you in your research? And I'll give you some seconds to type because I know it's longer than a single word. In terms of locations, I'll put one out there because I don't have to type. In terms of locations, we use those locations to establish trends. We can use that to parse information and parse out trends in our data. So in some cases, metadata is absolutely fundamental to the interpretations that we make in the science that we do. You might also be interested in, if you're using a sample, we have Marcella on the call from a state's geological survey. Maybe if you're reusing a sample from a managed collection, you need to know something about how that sample was processed. If you're using a sample powder and something's been done to the sample powder, you need to know about that process to know if you can use that sample or not. Metadata is, yeah, important to identify how samples fit into the location, trends, and formations. Exactly. Reusability, it won't be useful. And I think this is really critical. And we think about the fact that we collect samples on funded research and wanting to make the most of those samples and that investment. And if we don't have good metadata, we might have an inability to reuse or discover those samples. Yep, findability. Okay, yep, concepts of metadata being useful for the user and really also very useful for the collector, so that you don't have to rely on memory. So much of this, how many times have you come back to a sample or a piece of data and you can't remember what you did to get to that result? That's true for sample metadata as well. Once you're away from the field, you don't have that information in front of your eyes anymore. So capturing it while you're there is really important, and being as thorough as possible in capturing that rich metadata. This is our last question. Then you don't have to work so hard. What challenges in the Zoom chat? What challenges do you face in managing your sample metadata? What's hard about dealing with this data for you? I'll put one in the chat. See. So the one I put in there was storing files in a consistent way, thinking about naming schemes, folder structures, standardization, making sure that you're categorizing them in a consistent way that has relationships to other samples. Dealing with lots of data and lots of methods that don't always correlate. Yeah, so dealing with different types of information. In some cases, it's words, some cases, numbers, coordinates, and keeping these populated and consistent. That's great. We're gonna put a pin in metadata. Keep the comments rolling in the chat. They're really useful for us too, because we can kind of look at where people's minds are at and what types of information they're dealing with, and we can take that back and think about it in terms of improvements for our system, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. I want to introduce the concept, or maybe you already have heard of, persistent identifiers. Sometimes people call them PIDs, PIDs. These are long-lasting digital references to an object, a contributor, an organization. Increasingly, that list gets longer, right? Potentially instruments, maybe grants. So these are a code, or you can think of it kind of like a URL, but it's different. You can think of these as a place of a mechanism to identify a digital object regardless of changes to its physical location or to its digital location on the internet. So in contrast to URLs, how many times have you clicked on a link and the URL is broken, right? The page was updated. Maybe it's a university page, maybe it's some other page. That page no longer exists after a couple of years. They've done some website restructure and it's gone. Persistent identifiers will persistently and permanently resolve, and that's like inherent in their definition and their characterization. Two examples that you may be familiar with. One on the right is paper DOIs. So a DOI is a persistent identifier for papers and other digital objects, which we will talk about shortly because samples are included in that as well. ORCIDs are unique and persistent identifiers to identify people. And these will become important for engaging with our system too, because this is the way by which we have users log in and validate to log into their account. These are both persistent identifiers. You can see they have slightly different looks to them, and we'll break that down here on the next slide. Another persistent identifier beyond ORCIDs, beyond paper DOIs, is called the International Generic Sample Number. It used to be called the International Geo Sample Number. So if you've been around for a while, maybe you're used to the International Geo Sample Number. The IGSN is the abbreviation. This is a persistent identifier for physical samples. And IGSNs, importantly, are also DOIs. So I'm showing on the right a paper DOI at the top. That looks maybe familiar to you. You're used to seeing paper DOIs when you reference papers in term papers or in journal publications. Below it is a sample IGSN, which also has that DOI prefix, but it's got some other alphanumeric characters to the end of it. And we'll get to that later on, what those are and what types of customization you have in producing those. So the rest of the talk today is going to kind of focus on what persistent identifiers, what these IGSNs are, how they relate to SESAR, and what they can do for you and your research. And again, if there's questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat as we go so that I can ideally clarify anything that comes up. I haven't told you much yet about them, but with the information that I've provided, and maybe if you have any other background information on them, why might a persistent identifier for samples be useful? And you can put that in the chat. So if you think about the ways that you use DOIs or ORCIDs, what might it do to be able to, what might be useful about being able to persistently resolve to an internet page that says something about a sample? Yeah, something that having a digital space that exists indefinitely so that you can link digitally the physical sample with the metadata and the data derived from that sample. That's great. That's perfect. Sample PIDs are useful for long-term accessibility, like we just saw in the chat. This is a way to maintain and ensure that sample metadata remains accessible. So it's not buried in a field notebook that's unpublished or unscanned. It's not buried in little components of method sections or descriptive backgrounds within papers. It's a single place where anyone can go to see all of the metadata, key metadata that's tied to a sample. Having a persistent identifier for samples means that that sample is and will be interoperable to varying extents, which means that if there's different types of search platforms or sample discovery portals, think of kind of like a Google for samples. If there are any of those that exist now or come online in the future, they might be able to be integrated to that, which means that your samples will be more discoverable. I think this is really an important point for, in particular, some of our managed collection partners as well. So how do you surface collections more broadly? It's also important for data integrity and quality control. Think about maybe if you have a collaborator and they say, hey, can you send me the GPS points for that sample that you shared with me? And you're going fast and you're trying to send the email off and you got to go dig up all of the spreadsheets and maybe there's an error made in that location. Having a sample persistent identifier that links to a consistent landing page reduces those types of errors and makes and designates a clear source of truth for sample metadata. So anybody that is working with or with that sample or derivatives of that sample can point to the same spot and have the same information about that sample metadata. It also enhances and really enables that tracking that Joseph was pointing out in the chat. So tracking samples and the related data products. That's a little bit of setup, kind of like a brief crash course into sample metadata and persistent identifiers for samples. We'll continue to refine these concepts and make them, I think, more tangible as we go forward. I have a few slides now about what SESAR is and what we offer. And if you've tuned into one of our webinars recently, these may be kind of repeat, so bear with me. SESAR, or the System for Earth and Extraterrestrial Sample Registration, is an open repository and a searchable catalog for sample metadata. So this is a platform that helps make samples more discoverable, accessible, and reusable. And it connects the samples with the knowledge ecosystem derived for them. So papers, data sets, photos, all of that information can be linked through a sample record that's registered with SESAR. And we offer a wide range of services to support you along the life cycle of your samples. So we have a dashboard that supports management of sample metadata. We have user support, and we have curatorial review of metadata to make sure that you're able to provide as rich of a record as possible to really maximize that reusability component of your samples. We surface a public catalog for user contributed sample metadata, and this supports discovery and access. And we also register sample metadata and mint IGSNs that you can then use in all of your data products. Our catalog has over 5 million samples with a wide range of sample types. So not just rocks, but other solid materials, meteorites, fluids, gases, soils, peat samples, other biological samples, synthetic experimental samples, really a broad range of Earth, space, and environmental science communities are served by SESAR. Showing on the right a map of where our users come from globally. We have a global user community of over 1,600 users, and this ranges from individual researchers up to big museums like the Smithsonian and sample and core repositories, state geological surveys, and other funded projects. And we are recommended by funders and publishers and as a recognized place to store sample metadata. We're really proud that SESAR is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. SESAR was started in 2004 out of a NSF small grant for exploratory research. And that grant set out to develop the prototype of the IGSN and SESAR. And since then, both IGSN and SESAR have undergone some name changes over the years as their scope and adoption of the IGSN has expanded. And truly, we are a system for users big and small, and we're really proud to serve this range of users. So on the screen are some of the sample collections that we expose in the sample discovery portal. And so these are partners who are registering or have registered their collections through SESAR and have IGSNs attached to their samples. So you can use our search portal to see what types of samples they have that you might be able to reuse. People may have varying degrees on the call about FAIR. This is a buzz acronym, I guess you would call it, that you'll see increasingly in funder communications and grants. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Each of those in and of themselves have a lot more that you could drill into. But what we want to highlight here is that SESAR provides a way for you to make your samples fair. We often hear fair talked about in terms of data, and so too there are sample metadata and ways to make that fair. We do this by having quality control of the metadata that comes into our system. So that's that curatorial review and some other automated validation that helps make sure that there's not errors in location, errors in categorization. We allow users to externally link publications and data. Right now, this is something that is done on the user end, and we can talk about ways to build that into your workflow to make sure you get that metadata updated through time. We support data embargoes, which means that if you go out and collect samples and you want to get your metadata organized, but maybe you don't want your samples to be exposed in that public search interface, we support you in that. You're able to control the start and end dates of that embargo period. And so if you're a student, especially maybe a graduate student, and you want to be able to kind of just work on those samples and not have them out in the open, you can do that. You can embargo your metadata. We have sample appropriate metadata because we're talking about a broader network of persistent identifiers. A lot of those are not scoped to support samples. IGSNs are. And so we're really proud of the work that goes into supporting that metadata profile and the vocabularies that are behind that, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. Of course, the key in all this, we mint persistent identifiers, which just means that we generate that DOI link for you that you can then copy paste and put into your publications and your data tables. And we provide that permanence, that sustainable access to the metadata. We just revised our sample discovery portal back in July. and it was due for an update, and we're really happy with this kind of interim update. We have more support and funds to continue to revise this in the next couple years, and so we're excited about that. This is what it looks like, part of what the sample interface, search interface looks like on the right. You can search by a lot of different types of metadata. So you can look by sample names. Maybe you're reading a paper and you want to see if that person has registered their sample for an IGSN. You can plug the sample name in. You can search by country if you're interested in samples from a certain country or a certain region. You can search by field names, material types. And so we encourage you to explore this, and we can look at this later in demos if people are interested. It's accessible from our website, geosamples.org. You can also download a list of samples. So maybe you're thinking about a research project and you want to see what's out there. You can go do that. You can see who's registered samples. We only can expose, or we only currently expose samples for which users have come and registered that metadata with us. And so obviously it's not going to be something that's comprehensive and representative of all samples ever collected. But like I said, we have over 5 million samples registered to date. This is the rest of the search interface. It's a longer page, so it's hard to show on one page. You can do things like only show me the samples in the system that have latitude, longitude. You could say only show me samples that have images. That might be a small percentage right now because it's hard to get people to upload images, even though they're really important for helping people determine whether the sample is going to be valuable for use. And then we have a map. So you can create a polygon on the map, and maybe you're interested in a really narrow mountain range or certain part of the ocean. You could draw a polygon, and you can toggle on and off a couple different map layer types and change the projections. So we talked about registering samples with IGSNs. We talked about having this persistent place for storing metadata. This is what that place is. This is what you can think of as your sample profile page or sample landing page. This is the place where that sample metadata is exposed. So each sample that you register for an IGSN will get a sample landing page like this. And in this case, I'm showing an example of a core, a piece of a core that was registered. And this user has provided a nice core image, which we could click on and enhance. And it's actually, in this case, quite a high resolution core image. They've classified the material and said that it's sediment, and that's a controlled vocabulary that we use to enable search in the Discovery portal. So when you come to register samples with us, you will have access to lists of vocabularies that you'll need to categorize your samples in. We'll talk about that. And then we have some other parameters. So we know that it's a Holocene in age, and there's a comment with more descriptive information about how the cores are stored. Further down on that sample profile page, there's information about linked samples. In information science and here in SESAR, we refer to these as parent-child relationships. So a parent would be, maybe a hand sample that you collected in the field of a rock. And then if you cut off a piece of that hand sample and powdered it for a chemical analysis, that powder might be a child. And so SESAR allows you to register both those entities and allow them in a way that they can be linked. And so someone could understand some of that provenance information about what exists on a sample. Maybe there's also a thin section. Maybe there's some hand-picked mineral separates. If you have all of those and you choose to register them for children IGSNs, they can link back to the parent, and that can be really useful for reuse. On the right, I'm showing here an example where the sample also has some data set. It has one data set and one journal article linked to it. And so just by clicking on those paper or data set DOIs, I can be taken to some information and some other products that were generated using this sample. I can also see some information about where that sample physically is currently located. It's in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Minnesota. One other thing that I'll mention is that as part of this IGSN registration, we also generate a QR code that you can use, and that QR code can be scanned, and then we'll take you right back to that sample landing page we were just looking at. So this can be really useful. You can use it in your collections. Maybe you're storing your sample collections that you're working on for a thesis in the basement of your department, or maybe you're part of a managed collection. These QR codes are an option for you to use to have some information really readily available, so that people that come after you, or maybe if you're collaborating with an advisor or other students, everybody can be taken to that source of truth, that record landing page. And we have templates that you can export from your SESAR account to print these out. So how does this process work? What do you actually do to get an IGSN and submit that metadata? We'll start on the left side of this diagram. So in this case, we are the research metadata depositor, kind of a big name, but you will prepare your metadata, and we have submission guidelines and templates for you to use to do that. When you're working with these templates, I encourage you to keep in mind the fact that a large portion of what SESAR does is expose these in a discovery portal. That seems maybe trivial because we're so used to having Google readily available, but actually exposing samples and making them searchable in a meaningful way, meaning that you could search by sample name or search by sample type, that's actually a non-trivial task. And so these templates might not look exactly like the way that you collect your sample metadata in the field, but using them and filling them out to the fullest extent that you can will help you in the long run in terms of maintaining consistency across your samples and the types of data that you manage about them, but also makes them increasingly discoverable. And so we really encourage you to provide as much information during submission as possible. You'll then take that template, which is an Excel sheet, and you will upload it on our website. We'll look at that interface in a minute. And then you hit a submit button, and then we move into the data curation process. So there's an immediate one that happens, which is just a automated validation that makes sure that if it's supposed to be numbers in the GPS thing, that there's no text, and vice versa. So there's an initial automated check. If something is off, if there's a typo in your spreadsheet, the system will tell you and guide you on what needs to be fixed. Once all of that is good, it will go into our system where it gets queued up for curatorial review by our data curator, who will look at it with more of that human eye and that curatorial expertise to see if there's anything that should be changed about maybe descriptions or providing encouragement to provide information about where the sample is located, et cetera. That's usually done pretty quickly, right? It can be a process of, and Sabes, correct me if I misspeak, but it could be as fast as a day or two, or maybe up to a week or two. And so we encourage you to do this early, ideally right when you come back from the field, because it's all fresh in your mind and you're in sample mode. But you can do it at any time of your process, including after you start to publish. But we encourage you to do it early. If there's anything that we see on the data curatorial end that needs to be kind of fixed or remedied, you'll get an email about it. And then if there's nothing to fix, you'll get an email back that will have that batch template with your IGSNs that you can then go and use. And those will always be accessible as well in your in your MySESAR account. This is what that MySESAR account looks like. And so there's kind of a lot of different options that we can drill into in live demos if people are interested in. We also have tutorials that on our website that will link you into. But this is kind of your management dashboard. In this case, in this screenshot, you can see under My Samples that this user has 588 registered samples. And they have ways to edit and update metadata. They can download additional templates. You could register an individual sample. So maybe you only have one sample, or you just collected an extra one, or you forgot one. You can just register an individual sample, and that happens directly in the user interface. You don't have to work with the Excel sheets for that. And you can do things like manage who can edit the metadata. So there's collaborative functions if you're working as part of a team. You can also group your samples, create sample groups, maybe for different field campaigns, and so on. So there's a lot that you can do in here. We're also working to modernize this interface, and that'll be coming down the pipeline maybe in the next, maybe late 2025, ideally. We have a couple other smaller updates that'll be coming out to better support user groups before then. When you log in for the first time, you will be prompted to create a user code. That user code is just a string that becomes part of that IGSN DOI string. So the user code is highlighted here on the screen in light blue. People get hung up on this sometimes. I encourage you to remember that this is just a persistent link that gives people access to that landing page. And this is kind of in contrast to the way that we usually think about our sample names, right? We spend time and care in thinking about how we're going to name our samples consistently. That can have some influence on what your user code is, but it also doesn't need to. So some people do their initials for their user code. Some people, if you're part of a research group, maybe your advisor has one user code that they want to use for all of their student samples. So have that conversation with your teams, with your supervisors. Make a choice. There's no one way to do it, and everybody does it a little differently. I used my initials, but I had a conversation with my supervisor when I was first registering. So we can talk about that more. And if you ever have questions on that, we're always happy to answer them on email as well.
One thing I want to point out, Natalie, just before you move on, is that if the user code is taken by someone else, which happens a lot, the system will notify you saying that it is taken to pick some other 3 random alphanumerical numbers. So you could pick whatever within that's available to you. And you can make multiple codes too.
Perfect. This is a screenshot of the quick guide, which is what you get when you download the batch template. We also have it available on Zenodo. This is a list of all of our vocabulary, our metadata fields. So there's over 70 different metadata fields that you can choose to provide information for. And so again, this is where SESAR, does a really good job in supporting sample-based persistent identifier needs, because all of these are tailored to the challenges and the types of metadata that sample-based scientists want to use. Some of the fields are kind of drop-down selections, so they would be controlled, which means that we have a set number of vocabularies types for you to fit into. Others might just be free text and allow you to do more description. And those are indicated in the quick guide as well. Once you have those IGSNs, there's a lot of things that you can do with them. Where do you put them? We would encourage you to put them anywhere that you can. And so in a publication, that might look like putting them as a column in a data table. It might look like putting them in text, citing them parenthetically in text. It might look like putting them in a data availability statement. Some of this is more feasible than others. Let's say you have a project or a paper that used 3 samples. That's no problem to list out those IGSNs in the data availability statement or in text. But if you used 1,000, maybe that's a lot harder. And so we're here to answer those questions and support you in that as well. The landscape for how to cite persistent identifiers for samples is definitely evolving. So publishers have variable guidance or no guidance currently about how to do this. There's people that are working on this. And so we recognize that it's can be confusing, and we want to answer your questions for that. When you do list an IGSN, wherever you're going to list it, I'm showing on the screen here how to do that. The ideal is to list it in its full DOI format and have the letters IGSN and then colon linked before that. The reason that this is important to do is that currently the way to kind of build some of these linkages across resources, across papers, across data sets relies on machine readability. And so for machines to be able to go recognize that DOI as an IGSN, they need that little prefix. So doing that, it looks kind of weird, but doing that greatly increases the chance that your samples are going to be found and linked. And Sage just put in the chat a copy of this flyer that I'm showing on the screen. This was an output that came out of a group consisting of a lot of different experts from federal agencies, universities, and other kind of publication entities. And this gives you some more specifics on how to do this. I want to be cognizant of the time and just say that we have some new features coming soon. We're on the cusp. We're in the testing phase for some added user group functionality. So that will be released before the end of 2024. We have ongoing user interface improvements to that SESAR dashboard coming down the pipeline in 2025. And we're also working to populate a new website that's going to have kind of overhauled guidance and FAQs. So we're really excited about this, and we're excited that you're along for the ride with us on this. And as we're getting some of that released, if you have questions, we are here for you at info@geosamples.org. With that, I'm going to check the chat. I will also